All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to video 4.1b for Washington State history. By the way, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. It depends when you're watching this. Before we get into the video, you may be wondering why I'm not wearing my normal tie, collared shirt. Well, today is fan day, so I just want to give a shout out to the Edmonton Oilers. Yes, they are an awesome hockey team, especially for those of you who are also from Alberta, but the southern region, and cheer for, shall we say, the bad, evil team. Anyways, really important to note, before we get into this video, that the USA in the 1800s viewed the natives as childlike. This is important to remember when we get into more talking about the treaties and tribal sovereignty. Let's talk about, first off, promises and expectations that people hoped could be seen through with the ratification of the treaties, but ultimately these promises and expectations were either not realized or were not fully realized. First off, the treaties were very much open to interpretation. What was put down in the treaty could be seen maybe in multiple ways. I'm going to have our dear friend Mr. Mint read an excerpt from the Treaty of Point No Point, which was written in the year 1855.
Hence, eastwardly and following the line of lands heretofore ceded to the United States by the Nisqually and other tribes and bands of Indians, to the summit of the Black Hills, and northeastwardly to the portage known as Wilkes Portage.
Thank you, Mr. Mint. Now, as you can see from this, this part of this article from the treaty was explaining what lands the tribe were going to lose. Now, if you weren't sure where the Nisqually were, you would have no idea where this was. Also, remember from the previous video, Native Americans did not view land ownership the same way we did. We may look and say the Nisqually land starts right here, when in actuality, everyone thinks the land starts over here. Now that would cause a huge amount of problems. Second off, we have this Wilkes Portage. Now, where exactly is Wilkes Portage? Maybe the natives didn't know. Maybe the natives thought the portage was somewhere else. Maybe what they called Wilkes Portage was something entirely different. So this is just a really small example of parts and treaties that could have been open to interpretation. Of course, I'm sure there were more. The next part of this promise and expectations of what was not met was the fact that treaties could be revised. So if the natives expected the treaties to be followed, from start to finish, all part of it, that expectation sadly would be missed. Mr. Mint's going to read another part of the Treaty of Point No Point, since he did such a good job previously.
Thanks, Mr. Volkman, for that wonderful, for that wonderful compliment. The President may, hereafter, when in his opinion the interests of the territory shall require, and the welfare of said Indians be promoted, remove them from said reservation to such other suitable place. He may also consolidate these Indians with other friendly tribes or bands.
Thanks, Mr. Mint. So once again, we see that the president could actually move the natives from their reservation if he deemed it in the best interest of the territory and of the natives. Remember, the USA government in the 1800s thought the natives as childlike. They're treating them like children. Hey, if we think it's best for you, we're gonna move you, Native Americans. They also could group a bunch of native tribes together into one reservation. So again, expectations and promises not being met. Finally, an expectation from the American side. The Americans hoped that the reservations could eventually, after 20 to 30 years, be disbanded, and that the natives could be easily assimilated into American culture. This is something I read and that came up a few different times in different essays and articles as I did research for this video. Again, this expectation, at least for the American government, totally was false. Treaties are open for interpretation, and treaties could be revised. Again, more promises and expectations not met. About part 2 of promises and expectations. Now, the coastal tribes were able to keep their fishing lands. They largely were not moved very much or very far. Really, they lost a lot of land, but they didn't have to move like the Plains Indians had to. We'll talk more about fishing rights on a couple slides. The Plains Indians, or those on the plateau, they were placed on much smaller reservations, and a lot of them were actually moved to an entirely different place. Now, they were still allowed to hunt on their normal and accustomed lands. However, that's going to be hard when, remember, plateau tribes, they followed their food and their prey. But if you're on a reservation, it's really hard to do that. So again, if the expectation is that I can really truly hunt the way I used to, that's not entirely true. Because farmers put up fences. Hard to hunt and follow food when the food has a fence and has to go in a different path than normal. Another expectation or promise that was not met had to do with how the treaties were communicated. First off, as Mr. Mint just read, the treaties themselves were utterly complicated, even for us who have spoken English for our whole lives. Think about Native Americans who either didn't speak a lick of English, or for that matter, maybe just started learning about it. They would not understand the English at all. Governor Stevens tried to communicate the treaties through interpreters. They even used Chinook jargon, which only had about 500 words. So really, these points were not communicated to their fullest ability. They were written in a very complicated form of English. So expectation that the natives would understand the treaties, totally not met. Another thing we have to remember about the communication aspect is that Stevens and the people with him assumed that the chief who signed the treaty, or the sub-chief who signed the treaty, spoke for the whole tribe. Again, that's not accurate. As we talked about last lesson, that's not how tribal leadership worked. You had the chief, you had the tribal council. They worked together. You can't just have one guy sign off for a whole tribe. That's how American government worked, not the chiefs, not the tribes. Also, another promise that wasn't met or expectation was the fact that some tribes had to share their reservations with mortal enemies. I don't have to explain why that's bad. Lastly, something that I read is that some tribes who had leaders who weren't fully pro-American were not given the best deals. That might explain why some tribes got more money or more land than others. We now need to talk about something called tribal sovereignty. Now, this is something that's very important and that comes up a lot, even today. And I did a lot of research on this and read a lot of different articles. So it's very interesting. First off, we need to know this. The tribes could govern themselves on their reservations, and they could govern themselves based on tribal laws and customs. However, they could only govern themselves if it was regulated to the reservations themselves. However, and there's a catch, federal law was still supreme. Remember in those treaties, they had to pledge dependence upon the American government? Yeah. This is where this kind of partly comes into play. This quote is from Chief Justice Marshall in 1831, saying that the tribes' relationship to the United States resembles that of a ward to his guardian. Think of a ward as a young child or a minor, someone under the age of 18, and the guardian could be a parent, a grandparent, an uncle, aunt, it's some adult in charge. What he's saying is that the Native Americans were like the child, the American government was like the loving, caring father. This was also called, what I read is called a trust relationship. Trust meaning, it's a legal word, and this is not by any means the actual definition. The Mr. Volkman definition has to do with someone who's put in charge of something, is responsible for something. So the American government was responsible for the Native American tribes. Really, when you look at it from the natives' perspective, especially nowadays, it's easy to see that tribes were seen as incompetent to rule themselves fully. They were not smart enough. As a result, they can make their own laws, but in the end, our laws, Americans, we trump whatever they do if we don't like it. Again, that's a very pessimistic way of looking at it. However, the state government had no power over tribal business. It was just the federal government, which was really just Congress. We're going to have a big conversation on this with a very present issue right now. Let's talk about fishing rights here. Almost last slide. The tribes were allowed to fish on their usual and custom lands, even if it was private land. Now, they could do this inside or outside the reservations. Do you see any problems with this? Think about it. Also, their fishing and hunting was not regulated by the state. If you have a parent who hunts or fishes, I'd like you to pause the video, or after the video, I want you to go talk to them and ask them about the regulations that they have to follow with hunting and fishing. And after they tell you that, know this: Native Americans do not have to meet these regulations. Now, this non-regulation and these fishing rights was fine and dandy until about the turn of the century in the 1900s, when commercial fishing became prosperous. There was lots of competition for fish. People thought, oh no, the fish are going to be gone. There was competition. So a size limit was introduced. The tribes didn't like this because they felt like their tribal sovereignty was being messed with. Then along came the Bolt decision, which further strengthened treaty rights